Anisimova just beat Eala. She should be the one celebrating right now, talking about her own game, her own win. Instead, the first thing out of her mouth was about the player she just defeated. That is not how winners usually talk. Think about how post-match interviews normally go after a win like this. A quick nod to your own performance, maybe a mention of the crowd. Rarely does the winner spend their moment in the spotlight praising the person standing across the net who just lost. But that is exactly what happened here. So what did Anisimova actually say? What made her choose, in the middle of celebrating a win over a top 10 showdown, to talk about Eala first? Here is the thing. This was not some throwaway line, some polite nothing you forget 5 seconds later. This was specific. This was intentional. And once you hear the full context of what she said, it starts to sound less like a compliment and more like a confession. A confession about who Eala actually is right now, in the eyes of the players who have to face her. We are going to break down exactly what Anisimova said, word by word, and what it reveals about Eala that no scoreline could ever show you. Because a winner does not usually hand the spotlight to the player she just beat. Not unless there is a reason. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand why one sentence from a rival, spoken right after a brutal 3-set battle, might tell you more about Eala than the entire match itself. But first, you need to understand exactly how brutal that match actually was. This was not a routine straight sets win. This was a 3-set battle that swung back and forth from start to finish. Eala took the first set 6-4, playing the kind of tennis that had carried her through an entire summer of upsets against players ranked well above her. Anisimova answered right back, taking the second set by the same score, 6-4, forcing a decider. And the third set is where things got strange. Eala broke serve early. She built a 2-games-to-love lead, 2 games away from closing out a win over a legitimate top 10 opponent. Then Anisimova found something. 6 straight games. The match ended 2-6 in the third. And just like that, a match Eala had control of for most of the night slipped away in a matter of minutes. Now picture what that actually looks like from across the net. You are Anisimova. You are ranked 10th in the world, and you just spent close to 2.5 hours fighting off a 21-year-old who beat Iga Swiatek at Wimbledon a few weeks earlier, who just won her first WTA title beating Jessica Pegula in a final, who has quietly built one of the best top 10 win records in the entire sport this year. This was not a mismatch. This was 2 players who both had to earn every single game. That context matters, because it changes how you should read whatever comes out of the winner's mouth afterward. A 3-set battle like that is not the kind of match where players hand out empty compliments. When you have been pushed that hard, for that long, by someone that good, whatever you say afterward tends to be honest. There is no energy left for polite scripted answers. What comes out is usually what you actually think. So keep that in mind, because in a few minutes, you are going to hear exactly what Anisimova said the moment she walked off that court. And once you know how hard that match actually was, her words are going to hit very differently. If you have been following Eala's run this summer and you are just as curious as I am about how her rivals are actually talking about her behind the scenes, this is exactly the kind of story worth sticking around for. Because what Anisimova revealed goes way beyond one match. Because here is what almost nobody talks about after matches like this. The score tells you who won. It never tells you what the players actually think of each other. And what Anisimova said next tells you a lot more than 2-6 ever could. Right after walking off that court, Anisimova did not lead with herself. She did not open with how she turned the match around in the third set. She did not open with how she handled the pressure of a decider against a red-hot opponent. The very first thing she talked about was Eala. She called her a great player. She called her a fighter. And she said she knew going in that this was going to be a really tough match. Sit with that phrasing for a second. She knew, before the first ball was even struck, before either player had won a single game, Anisimova was already bracing herself for a battle. not against some unranked wild card. Against a 21-year-old ranked 20 in the world. Someone who technically should not scare a top 10 player before a match even begins. This is not a huge shock if you look at the resume, but it is a shock to hear it spoken out loud, unprompted, in the immediate afterglow of a win. So here is the mini question worth sitting with. Why would a top 10 player, someone with a resume to just talk about her own game, choose instead to spend her first words acknowledging the danger her opponent posed? Winners do not usually do that. Winners usually frame the match around themselves, unless the respect is real enough that framing it any other way would feel dishonest. Now go back to that third set collapse. Eala up 2-0, then losing 6 straight. On paper, that looks like a player who cracked. That looks like a moment where the loser deserves less credit, not more. And yet, even after watching that exact sequence happen right in front of her, Anisimova still chose the word fighter. Think about how specific that is. Not talented, not skilled, fighter. That is not a word you use for someone who folds. That is a word you use for someone who made you work for every single point, even in the moments when the match was slipping through her fingers. So now we have two things sitting side by side that do not seem to fit together. A player who just lost 6 straight games in the biggest moment of the match, and an opponent who, minutes later, is calling her one of the toughest competitors she has faced. How do both of those things exist in the same sentence? Is this just standard sportsmanship, the kind of thing players say to be polite in front of cameras? Or is there something underneath that comment that goes deeper than good manners? Because here is what makes this genuinely hard to write off as empty praise. Top 10 players do not need to compliment players ranked below them. There is no obligation here. Nobody would have blinked if Anisimova had simply talked about her own game and moved on. She chose not to. And that choice alone should make you pause. Because if this really was just a polite line, it would have stopped there. A quick compliment, a quick pivot back to herself. Done. It did not stop there. There was more. Something Anisimova said next that goes far beyond calling an opponent tough. Something that, once you hear it, makes this entire interview feel less like sportsmanship and more like an accidental confession about exactly what kind of player and what kind of presence Eala has already become on this tour. Here is the part almost nobody talking about this interview has actually picked up on. Anisimova did not stop at calling Eala a fighter. She went further. She talked about the crowd. She said there was a lot of support for her that night, and she appreciated it, because she understood exactly why Eala is so loved. Not vaguely respected, loved. And she said she understood why. Read that again, because this is the part that flips everything. A player who just won a tense 3-set battle against Eala took a moment to acknowledge that the crowd, in that arena on that night, was not fully behind her. They were behind Eala. And instead of brushing past that, Anisimova named it directly and said she got it. Here is the assumption almost everyone makes without even thinking about it. We assume respect between rivals is mostly about skill. One player admires another player's game, her serve, her return, her fight. That is usually where it ends. Skill respects skill. That is the story we expect. But what Anisimova described is not that. She was not just talking about Eala's tennis. She was talking about how a crowd, made up of strangers with no particular loyalty, responded to her as a person. That is a completely different category of respect. That is not admiration for a skill set. That is recognition of a presence. Think about what it actually takes for a player to earn that kind of crowd reaction on a random Monday night at a WTA 1000 event, not a home country final, not a milestone match, just a third-round contest in Ohio. And think about what it takes for an opponent, in the immediate aftermath of a win, to notice that reaction and openly validate it instead of ignoring it. Here is the analogy that makes this click. Imagine you are the best player in your office at your job. You get a promotion over a coworker in a tight, competitive process. Most people in that position talk about their own performance afterward. their strategy, their preparation, why they earned it. It is rare for the person who just won to turn around and say, "By the way, everyone in this building loves my coworker, and honestly, I get why." That is not something you say unless it is simply true, and obvious enough that pretending otherwise would feel strange. That is what just happened here. Anisimova won. She had every reason to make this moment entirely about herself. Instead, she used part of her own victory speech to validate the crowd's loyalty to the player she beat. So put the two revelations next to each other. First, a top 10 opponent admitting she feared this matchup before it even started. Second, that same opponent acknowledging out loud that the crowd's affection for Eala made complete sense to her. That is not one compliment. That is a rival describing Eala the way you would describe an established star, not a 21-year-old still building her reputation. This is the moment where the story stops being about one tennis match. Because if this is really how a top 10 opponent talks about Eala, even in defeat's aftermath and even in victory's afterglow, then what we are looking at is not just a good player having a good summer. We are looking at someone whose presence on tour has already outgrown her ranking. And if you think that is a big claim to make off one interview, wait until you see how consistent this pattern actually is once you look beyond just this one match. If you still think this was just one nice quote after one emotional match, look at what surrounds it. Because none of this happened in isolation. Start with the number that should have been impossible to ignore walking into that match. Eala's career record against top 10 opponents sits at 9 wins and 5 losses. Read that again. 9 wins against the best players alive at 21 years old. That is not a fluke. That is not one good week. That is a body of work substantial enough that a top 10 player would have every reason to walk into a match against her feeling exactly what Anisimova described. Fear before the first ball is even struck. Now add the second piece. Before this loss, Eala had won 6 straight matches against top 10 opponents. 6 in a row. Think about what that means from Anisimova's side of the net. She was not just facing a talented 21-year-old. She was facing someone who had made a habit of ending the tournament runs of players just like her. That is exactly why she said she knew this was going to be a tough match before it even began. The data backed up the fear completely. And here is the third piece, the one that connects everything back to that comment about the crowd. This match did not happen in Manila. It did not happen at some hometown event where the crowd's loyalty would be obvious and expected. It happened in Cincinnati, Ohio, a WTA 1000 event on American soil, in a third-round match that was not even the headline of the night. And still, the energy in that arena leaned toward Eala. Still, Anisimova felt it strongly enough to mention it unprompted. That is not home crowd advantage. That is a crowd that has simply chosen to love a player, regardless of geography. So let's go back to the question we opened this video with. Why would a winner spend her moment in the spotlight talking about the player she just beat? Now you have the answer. Because everything Anisimova said lines up perfectly with everything the numbers already show. The fear before the match was earned by a real resume. The praise after the match was earned by real fight, visible even in a set where Eala led 2 games to love and still lost 6 straight. And the crowd's love was not a coincidence. It was already there, building match after match, city after city, all summer long. None of this is one isolated compliment. This is a top 10 opponent accidentally confirming, out loud, exactly what the numbers had already been saying for months. And there is one more detail that ties all of this together, a detail about Eala's position heading into this tournament that most people covering this match completely missed. So what does Anisimova's comment actually tell us? Not just that she is polite, not just that she respects a good opponent. It tells us that Eala has already become something bigger than her ranking suggests. A player top 10 opponents fear before the match even starts. A player crowds choose to love, even hundreds of miles from home. A player whose own rivals describe her the way you describe an established star, not a rising one. And here is why that matters right now. Because of injuries to several other seeded players, Eala walked into Cincinnati as the 17th seed, the highest of her entire career. The rankings are already catching up to what her opponents have clearly known for a while. The US Open is next, and she is heading there with that same career-high status, carrying exactly the kind of respect Anisimova just put into words for the entire tennis world to hear. So here is the real question going forward. If a top 10 opponent talks about her like this after a loss for Eala, what happens the next time she actually wins? What happens when the player earning this kind of respect in defeat finally puts together a run deep into a grand slam? Nobody knows yet. Not the fans, not the analysts. Maybe not even Eala herself. But if you want to find out the moment her US Open draw comes out, and hear exactly how her next opponents talk about her before and after they play her, this is the channel to be watching. Subscribe now, because the next confession from a rival might be even bigger than this one.